I'm Kay.
And I'm Max.
And you're watching The Watch List.
Fantasy Island is an American fantasy drama series created by Gene Levitt. The show aired on ABC from 1977 to 1984 and starred Ricardo Montalban as Mr. Rourke, an overseer of a mysterious island that had the ability to let people live out their fantasies, but always with a price. The show was famously produced by Aaron Spelling, who produced The Love Boat, Charlie's Angels, and Dynasty. Even with huge production credits for the network to his name, getting Fantasy Island off the ground at ABC, which insiders called the Aaron Broadcasting Company, wasn't as easy as Spelling thought. Actually, Spelling didn't plan on getting Fantasy Island off the ground at all. Fantasy Island was a joke pitch. Fantasy Island was Aaron Spelling scraping the bottom of the barrel. It was only after an executive at ABC turned down 6 of his other pitches that Spelling, frustrated with the executive's response, blurted out, "What do you want? An island that people can go to and all their sexual fantasies will be realized?" They loved it. They wanted Orson Welles for the show. The network couldn't get him. But they still loved that joke pitch so much that they shelled out thousands of dollars to bring celebrity guests onto Fantasy Island each episode, and often for repeat appearances. So, the lesson is always say literally the dumbest thing on your mind. You might think it's stupid, and it might be, but you never know. Or maybe that only works if you're a well-respected and liked World War II veteran producer with several hit shows under your belt. Maybe you should stick to your best ideas.
With Fantasy Island's successful past as a TV show, Sony Pictures wanting to revive the series with a feature film seemed to make sense. And partnering with Blumhouse on the film made even more sense, due to Blumhouse's recent interest in reviving branded properties like Halloween and M. Night Shyamalan's feature film Glass. However, Blumhouse wanted to revive Fantasy Island with a dark twist at its center, comparing its vision of the film to Westworld meets Cabin in the Woods. They slated the film for a horror reimagining, which would also serve as a prequel to the original TV series. Blumhouse's Fantasy Island was eventually released by Sony Pictures on February 14, 2020, and went on to be a box office success, grossing $47 million against its $7 million production budget. Fantasy Island is also one of the top 10 highest grossing films of the year so far, raking in $26 million in the United States alone. However, despite its financial success, Fantasy Island wasn't a hit with critics. Honestly, it doesn't seem like it was a hit with audiences either, judging by its 48% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. What was it about Fantasy Island that inspired film critics like Michael Phillips of the Chicago Tribune to write in his review of the film, 4 intertwining fantasies, 4 stories worth of lame ideas, poorly executed. Call it The Plane Crash. Call it The Island of Dr. No Thank You. Call it Worst World. Call it The Butterfly Effect, with a dead butterfly and no effect.
Let's find out what went wrong. 2 tickets to Fantasy Island, please.
I don't think that's how this...
Blumhouse's Fantasy Island was directed and co-written by Jeff Wadlow, who also co-wrote Bloodshot. That's a movie we wanted to review for the show, but realized there's not much to say. Bloodshot suffered from a cast of underdeveloped characters, a plot that ultimately lacked emotional resolution, and an overabundance of exposition that treated us like their target demographic of preteens, half watching it while scrolling through their phones. Its biggest sins are that it's hollow and boring. And then we watched Fantasy Island, which suffered from all the same problems as Bloodshot, except cranked up to 11. So we really could have just reviewed Bloodshot instead of giving Sony Pictures even more of our money. But we didn't, so congratulations, Sony Pictures, on getting us to pay for what, in several ways, was the same movie twice. That's $35 to Sony Pictures that we're never going to get back. It's like a really, really bad DoorDash order. You get it, and you're excited about it because you spent $35 on it, and you paid a large tip and everything. Then you realize they thought you wanted extra cheese on your California roll. Why would I want extra cheese on my California roll? It's the last time I ever order takeout from a buffet. Fantasy Island is a bad movie. It's not fun bad. It doesn't live up to the trailer's promise of being so bad it's good. It is a $7 million exploitation film that looks like it was filmed for $3 million. This is a uniquely bad movie that manages to give us jump scares that aren't scary, jokes that aren't funny, a mystery that's not compelling, visceral horror that's not disturbing, an island that breaks its own magical rules, 2 twists that amount to a pair of rolled eyes, and an origin story that is never explained in even the most oblique way. In a film that manages to explain its major twists on screen with 3 nearly identical exposition dumps, this film is embarrassingly sparse in places. You don't laugh at how ridiculous it is, you feel bad for everyone involved. Michael Peña deserved better than this.
There are 2 nice things we can say about this film. The first thing is that the aerial shots of the island are beautiful. And the second thing is that this movie's very existence proves that Hollywood is still willing to throw money at anything and everything. Honestly, I didn't think studios were still greenlighting movies this awful, so it's refreshing to see. You know, the same way salt water is refreshing to someone who's been dehydrated for days. Thanks. Thanks for the salt water, Sony. Fantasy Island opens with 5 people all arriving on the island at the same time. Gwen Olsen, a woman who's employed at a place and does a thing. The movie never goes into this. Patrick Sullivan, a police officer with daddy issues. JD and Brax Weaver, stepbrothers who never let you forget that they're stepbrothers for even 1 single second. And Melanie Cole. That's it. Just Melanie. Okay, moving on.
Before the group meets with Mr. Rourke, the keeper of the island, they mingle for a little bit among themselves, and this is where we first noticed this movie was going to be awful, because no one in this movie talks like a real person. Every line of dialogue is either exposition heavy or a transparent attempt at getting the audience to build an emotional bond with the characters without doing the work of making them interesting or relatable. There's nothing that they show when they're able to tell it. Actually, if there was a 1-sentence review of this movie, that would be it. For example, did you know the stepbrothers were stepbrothers? Do you see how close they are? Look, they won't stop high-fiving. They make terrible Van Wilder direct-to-video style bro jokes back and forth that get not one laugh. If you see this in here and it doesn't work, why keep it? It just distracts from the rest of the movie. It doesn't really come back. And most importantly, it's not entertaining. This is a 110-minute movie that should be 80 minutes long. After that cringe fest of a hangout, we finally meet Mr. Rourke, played by Michael Peña. Of course, the movie completely wastes known multi-talented actor Michael Peña in this role by having him play a wooden, static character. I know he can play both serious and funny based on his work in Narcos and Ant-Man and the rest of his filmography, but he does neither here. He does a bland Ricardo Montalban impression. I blame the script more than him, but you can never really get a consistent read on him. The film doesn't think any farther than his ability to sneak into conversations unexpectedly and be ingratiating in a fairly obvious way. Most better horror movies would use camera angles or subtle sound mixing or shot framing to imply that there's something sinister about Rourke in this island. For reasons we'll get into later, at this point we already know Rourke is sinister. So what purpose does him coyly ingratiating himself to the guests in the first half of this film serve? It's just very sloppy.
Mr. Rourke then explains that there are only 2 rules on Fantasy Island. Each guest only gets to have 1 fantasy, and each fantasy has to be seen through to its final conclusion, no matter what. Once the guests agree to the island's terms, the fantasies are ready to begin. The first fantasy we see belongs to the stepbrothers, with their fantasy simply being to have it all. JD and Brax soon enter an ongoing party at a mansion, complete with hot girls, hot guys, and lots of party favors. The second fantasy belongs to Gwen, since she wants to know how her life would have turned out if she'd accepted an ex-boyfriend's marriage proposal years ago. She seemingly steps back in time to accept his proposal, and her fantasy life plays out as if she'd said yes. The third fantasy we see belongs to Patrick, whose fantasy is apparently to enlist in the US military. I'm sorry, but this fantasy just makes 0 sense. How is being in the military an impossible dream for Patrick? He was a police officer, and he looks like he's in pretty good shape. Couldn't he have just tried to join the military when he was younger too? He also says in the movie that he wants to join the military to see some action, but again, Patrick is a police officer, right? He didn't see enough action at his 9 to 5? Also, whose fantasy is just them doing another type of job?
The movie tries to pull a switcheroo with Patrick's fantasy, by the way. As soon as Patrick starts his fantasy as a soldier, the film reveals that Patrick's fantasy actually has him serving with his father, who died while on a mission when Patrick was young. As it turns out, Patrick's fantasy wasn't really to be in the military. It was to see his father again. This little twist would have been fine if it made any sense. If the island is able to look into people's hearts or whatever, why did it only do it for Patrick? Why not do it for the other characters too? Are you trying to tell me that Brax and JD's deepest fantasy was throwing a huge house party? They look like millennials to me. What about canceling their student debt or owning a huge house of their own? I'm just saying, you can't tell me this island has the ability to give people what they really want and not have at least one shot of someone triumphantly ripping apart their last student loan payment to Sallie Mae. Anyway, the final fantasy we see belongs to Melanie, whose fantasy involves getting revenge on a girl who bullied her in high school. Melanie gets really into it too. She dumps some pee on the bully's head. She uploads a video of the bully cheating on her husband to Facebook. But just when she's about to keep going with the torture, Melanie realizes that this isn't a fantasy. This is real life, and she's actually torturing her bully, not some fantasy island version of her. Freaked out, Melanie's like, hey, I didn't sign up for the potential jail time. This is not the entree I ordered. And she helps her bully escape from the torture chamber. Before they can escape, Melanie and the bully have to fight off Dr. Torture, who's Melanie's old therapist from when she was a kid. His mouth is sewn shut because Melanie mentioned that she used to fantasize about sewing his mouth shut. Why is he a villain in her fantasy? Why are there any villains in her fantasy? Aren't fantasies supposed to generally be a good time? What? I get the monkey's paw nature of this film. It's not lost on me that these characters might not actually want what they feel they want. It's not inconsistent, it's just trite. More on this part later.
After Melanie and the bully escape the torture zone, they run into Damon, a private investigator who's been trapped on this island for a while. Damon figured out that Fantasy Island runs on spring water that can only be found in the heart of the island, and he wants to smuggle some water off the island to expose Rourke. Of course, the movie never explains why a man who was hired to investigate Fantasy Island ended up trapped on the island too. If he was hired, doesn't that imply that someone would have noticed when he didn't come back with their report? Or does the island somehow exist outside of time and space? Has no one come looking for Damon because he's only been gone for a few minutes when to him it's felt like days?
Only the island knows.
The movie then goes back to Gwen, who's just now realizing, after living out her life for 5 years with her now husband and child, that the magic of Fantasy Island is real. Gwen then realizes that she wants a new fantasy, soon arguing with Rourke that the island got her initial fantasy wrong, and that her wish for a family wasn't her real fantasy, after all. In fact, Gwen's real fantasy is to go back in time and save someone from a burning building, something she regrets not doing years ago when she had the chance. Hey, guys, remember that thing that the island can do, where it has the ability to figure out your real fantasies? Are you wondering why the island just wouldn't do the same thing for Gwen? Yeah, we wondered that too. To be fair, it's possible the writers just forgot about all the rules they made up, or the director just thought if there were enough attractive people in the movie, we wouldn't be paying too much attention to the plot. I mean, let's be real, it's worked on me before.
Around the same time that Gwen is changing her fantasy, JD and Brax are being attacked by a drug cartel, who are killing party guests and storming the mansion. They try to call Mr. Rourke for help, but instead of offering them any assistance, he calmly tells them that a natural consequence of having it all is that other people will want to take it. Is that what we're doing now? Some kind of Twilight Zone-esque moral lesson in the middle of this dumpster fire of a movie? Sure, this may be in line with the original Fantasy Island TV series, but this kind of storytelling device has no place here. This is supposed to be a horror movie reboot. Nothing about the JD and Brax storyline or the Patrick storyline screams horror movie. It's forced, it's bloated. It's like they put this in here so they could still legally use the title Fantasy Island before they go right back to defiling the franchise. This movie has no idea what it wants to be. Just because you can cram 4 storylines into one movie doesn't mean you should. Gwen, meanwhile, is in her fantasy running up the stairs of her old apartment trying to save Nick, the guy who lost his life from the fire. She sees Brax and JD on the steps and realizes they were also residents of that apartment. Later, she sees Patrick in the parking lot and approaches him for help with saving Nick. However, Patrick chooses not to help rescue him, and it's clear that he's scared to rush inside the building. Gwen decides to take the challenge on by herself and rushes into the fire again to save Nick. Her attempt isn't successful, but before she dies in the fire, she's pulled out by Julia, Mr. Rourke's assistant. The movie returns to Melanie and the bully in the woods. They're still hanging out with Damon and trying to figure a way off the island. They're attacked by Dr. Torture, and Damon sacrifices his life for Melanie and the bully girl in an act of true heroism. This is coincidentally also one of the best parts of the movie, because it features a spectacular failure of special effects when Damon and Dr. Torture both go flying off the cliff. Oh god, oh my god. I take back what I said. I love this movie. No notes movie, no notes. They could have had a shot of them looking over the cliff or just a shot of their dead bodies on the ground, but nope. They were like, we spent $7 on these dummies and by God, we're gonna use them. I cannot stress how much better Michael Rooker deserved than this movie. He dumps exposition twice in a way that highlights just how bad the writing is, where he has nothing to do but help broker a forced resolution between Melanie and her bully, which ends up being meaningless. More on that later. And then just barrels over the side of a cliff for no real reason. Beautiful.
After those amazing special effects, the movie brings us back to Patrick and his father, who both suddenly find themselves on the same mansion property as JD and Brax. During a lively shootout with the cartel, JD is killed, as well as Patrick's father, leaving Patrick and Brax both devastated at the loss. However, this scene just left me with even more questions than before. People can die on this island? Guests can just leave from their homes and never come back? Earlier in the film, characters joked about reading reviews online and people guessing what happens on the island or how it works. But if your fantasy can also kill you, I don't see why anyone would ever leave a positive review. This also destroys my earlier theory about the island being trapped outside of time and space, so now I have no idea what's going on with fantasies or how they're supposed to work. And after the shootout with the cartel, the dead cartel members reanimate as zombies, but JD just stays dead? How's Bert going to explain to his family?
Only the island knows.
Moving on from the death of JD, and rest in peace JD, the movie goes back to Melanie and her bully, still working together to get off the island. They soon discover a working telephone in the bully's torture chamber, and they use it to call the bully's husband for help. The scene culminates in the bully making a dual apology to both her husband for cheating on him and to Melanie for bullying her back in high school too, before Melanie and the bully are reunited with Gwen, JD, and Patrick. The bully's husband then says he's going to send help to the island, and it seems like everything's finally looking up for the Fantasy Island gang.
But just when things are looking up, Rourke reveals one of the film's useless, stupid twists. He tells the guests that they're actually not here to live out their own fantasies. Oh no, they're here to live out someone else's fantasy. And in this mystery person's fantasy, all the guests are supposed to be killed. As the characters try to figure out who would want them all dead, the film reveals how each guest was involved in Nick's fiery death. Gwen accidentally started the fire. JD and Brax were Nick's roommates that didn't check if he was there because he was supposed to be out with a girl. Are you paying attention? Patrick was too cowardly to save Nick from the fire, and, of course, Melanie was the girl who Nick was supposed to be going on a date with that night. But she admits that because of her low self-esteem due to being bullied, she ghosted him that night and he stayed home. The worst twist in the history of twists. The guests accuse Julia, Rourke's assistant, of somehow being in on this twisted fantasy. Why Julia?
She could be Nick's mom. He always told me how controlling she was, and Julia's eyes, they look a lot like Nick's.
Yep, perfect match.
The movie then shows the guests trying to escape, yet again, as they run out of their resort and onto the beach. The plane the bully's husband sent is there now, waiting to rescue the guests, but it's immediately shot out of the sky, along with 70% of the film's budget. After that, the guests run into a cave, and because this is a bad horror movie, they decide to split up for no reason. They come face to face with their personal demons, which sounds like it could be a good opportunity for some scares, but instead we get standard canned horror scares without context, like little girl turns out to be evil, and person is randomly grabbed by a million hands. After that, the guests regroup and find the source of Fantasy Island's magical water, which turns out to be a glowing rock. The movie then reveals an even bigger, even worse twist than before.
Surprise! This is all Melanie's fantasy. Melanie's the murderer. She's the one who wants everyone dead. And why? Because she went on one date with Nick before he died and decided that they were soulmates? After his death, she orchestrated this entire thing to get revenge on everyone involved. Why not, just get revenge on Gwen, the lady who burned down Nick's apartment? How did Melanie even know Patrick was there that night? Why is she also punishing JD and Brax for assuming Nick was out with her and not at home that night?
Only the island knows.
Look, this twist makes no sense. It's so bad that it undoes other interesting moments in the movie, like Melanie and her bully making up, and it renders one of the only character arcs in the movie completely pointless. It also just doesn't work, at all. If this was Melanie's fantasy all along, why was her life ever in danger with Dr. Torture? Why would she even add him to her fantasy when there was a risk of death? Is she just a sadist? By far the only and most convincing scene was her horror at realizing, hey, that's her bully. It's one of the few effective scenes, at least part of it anyway, in the film. She looks genuinely shocked to realize that her bully was actually on the island. The movie can't have the tension of that scene and also have Melanie be the grand evil architect of the film. Wouldn't Melanie know she's already on the island? Isn't it her who directed Rourke to kidnap her off screen? Hold on, isn't the island in charge? How did she direct Rourke? Seriously, the movie starts with the bully being chased and dragged against her will toward the torture chamber. We knew from the start what was going on, and so did Melanie. Was she acting surprised for the island's cameras? Just in case their video was submitted as legal evidence somewhere? How if everybody's dead except for Rourke and the island? The movie also reveals that Julia isn't just Mr. Rourke's assistant. She's his wife, and his fantasy is to keep her alive on the island despite the fact that she died years ago. In order to keep Julia alive as a fantasy, Mr. Rourke is tasked with carrying out the island's wishes, for better or worse. Or else the island will punish him by taking Julia away from him forever. None of this is revealed organically. We have characters delivering their lines, lots of exposition lines, during the climax. I kept wanting to check my phone, to be honest with you.
Reveal after reveal after reveal. Julia convinces Mr. Rourke to let the memory of her go, so he's able to fight against the island's wishes and save the rest of the guests. He then makes his peace with her death just in time to let Sloane, the bully, know that she actually gets a wish on the island too, because she's a guest and all guests get one fantasy, per the rules. Sloane then wishes for Melanie and Nick to be together forever, which the island interprets to mean that it's time for Melanie to die, and soon enough, Nick's burnt corpse grabs her and pulls her underneath the magical water. But before Melanie is drowned for good, she manages to use the last bit of her strength to throw a grenade out of the water and into the cave, where the rest of the guests are still standing. Thinking fast, Patrick throws himself onto the grenade, sacrificing himself for the rest of the guests, the same way his own father sacrificed his life for his fellow soldiers when Patrick was still a child. You get it? Because he's brave now. Patrick is so brave that after Melanie's twisted fantasy ends and the guests all escape to safety, Rourke hangs a picture of Patrick and his dad up on the wall in the Fantasy Island Resort, with absolutely zero context, so the island's future visitors can admire the photograph, even though they'll have no idea who Patrick and his father even are. Nice.
The movie ends with the remaining guests filing onto a waiting plane that doesn't blow up this time. However, for the film's final egregious twist, it's revealed that Brax never got to have a wish of his own. The party-based fantasy he shared with his brother being solely JD's wish. Brax then wishes for JD to come back to life, but Mr. Rourke warns that if JD is brought back from the dead, then Brax will have to stay on Fantasy Island forever. But why? Why do wishes work this way? None of the other guests have to stay. If this is how it works, couldn't Melanie have just wished Nick back to life? Couldn't she have just lived out the rest of her days with a Nick on the island? And why does Brax get to bring JD back without any weird island shenanigans? When Rourke wanted his wife back, the island brought her back with a price, keeping him tied to the island and erasing her memory so she never recognized him. But JD just gets to come back to life, no problem. And he remembers who Brax is too. Sure, Brax is tied to the island forever, but at least he can go to bed every night knowing his brother is safe and alive and not just some fantasy created by this nightmare of an island. I'm just saying, it looks like Rourke got the bad end of the deal here, and it's never explained why. I guess the island just hates Rourke for reasons. And I guess I have to accept that. I have to accept that this is how the movie ends, with JD coming back to life, with Brax staying behind on the island, with the rest of the guests leaving on the plane, joking and smiling as if half of them didn't die, as if they won't be calling the FBI the second their plane touches down on US soil. They just watched a woman be drowned to death by a burnt corpse, but sure, they'll still give Fantasy Island 4 stars on Yelp and tell their friends they had a good time.
Wait, that's not how the movie ends.
What are you talking about? The movie's clearly over.
No, you forgot the part where Mr. Rourke asks Brax if he wants to be his new assistant on the island. And then, the movie reveals that Brax's nickname when he was a kid was Tattoo. So he decides to go by that name from now on. This technically sets off the series of events that happened in the 1977 television show, solidifying this film as its rightful prequel.
No.
No?
They can't do that.
They can't do what?
They can't just break continuity like that. They can't try to tell me that this guy becomes this guy. They expect me to go along with this? This was a prequel the whole time? I said this movie was bad before, but you know what? I was wrong. This movie is worse than bad. This movie is evil. Fantasy Island is all of humanity's worst traits rolled into one and put on film. They try to make it a buddy film, a war film, a drama, and almost as an afterthought, a horror film. There are episodes of Goosebumps that are scarier, higher budget, and more tightly written than this. They could have kept the Gwen and Melanie storylines, thrown everything else out, rewritten Rourke, and tried again with a different set of writers. This idea had potential, but it decides to waste its 110 minutes explaining every single detail more than once. This is a movie that's not shot out of the sky with a rocket launcher. It's one where the plane crashes through the tarmac because the foundation is so hollow. If you try to figure out the reasoning for a lot of these creative choices, all you're left with is more questions. Try to piece together the plot, your eyes start oozing black and your stomach suddenly aches with an unnameable pain. Avoid this movie. Save yourselves. And for the love of all that is holy, never ever take a trip to Fantasy Island.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching the watch list.
If you like that video, please like and subscribe.
You can also follow us on Twitter and support us on Patreon. Okay, I have to go. I need to see if I can return these tickets to Fantasy Island. I got them on Delta, but I heard refunds are really hard to get right now.
Oof, yeah. Good luck with that one.
Wasn't Aaron Spelling the guy who had that $600 million mansion in LA?
Yeah, I think so.
God, could you imagine?
Having $600 million?
No, owning a house.
That's the real fantasy.